Night Slayer, Episode 3, The Time Eater, Chapter 1. In a brightly lit Brazilian jiu-jitsu school, Captain Damian Knight was in the midst of an intense training session. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he grappled with his BJJ professor, an older man with a wealth of experience and skill. Despite Damian's enhanced abilities and strength, the professor's technique was impeccable. With a swift and precise movement, the BJJ professor caught Damian in a chokehold, expertly locking it in. Damian struggled to escape, but the grip was too tight, the technique too perfect. After a few moments, he tapped out, signaling his submission. "You rely too much on your power and strength, Damian," the professor said, his voice calm but firm. "Technique always trumps brute force." Damian nodded, breathing heavily as he got to his feet. "I understand, Professor. Thank you for the lesson." After showering and changing, Damian left the school, deep in thought about the advice he had just received. He knew there was truth in the professor's words. His strength and abilities were formidable, but they could only take him so far without proper technique. Later that day, Damian met up with Professor Archer at their usual spot, a quiet cafe that served as their makeshift headquarters for planning and strategizing. "From one professor to another," Damian said with a grin. "At least you won't be choking me, Archer." Professor Archer looked up from his laptop, a serious expression on his face. Maybe not, but this information might. Intrigued, Damian sat down and leaned in as Archer turned the laptop toward him. "I've been looking into some unusual case studies from a remote town in Europe," Archer began. "There have been reports of victims suddenly aging overnight. It's as if their time is being stolen." Damian's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. "A vampire?" Archer nodded. "It certainly looks that way. The victims are left as withered husks, completely drained of their youth and vitality. I've cross-referenced the data with historical records, and it matches the pattern of a creature known as the Time Eater." Damian leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "If this vampire is out there, we need to stop it before it claims more victims." "Agreed," Archer said. "But we need to be cautious. This vampire's ability to consume time makes it incredibly dangerous. We can't afford any mistakes." Damian's resolve hardened. "Then let's get to work. We need to gather all the information we can and prepare for whatever comes our way." As they began to plan their next steps, the gravity of their mission settled over them. The fight against the Time Eater would be their most challenging yet, but Damian and Archer were determined to face it head on. The night was their battleground, and they would not rest until the vampire was stopped. Chapter 2. The small town of Hallstatt, nestled in the Austrian Alps, was known for its picturesque landscapes and serene atmosphere. However, as night fell, the quaint streets took on an eerie silence, the peaceful facades casting long, sinister shadows. A young man named Lucas was making his way home from a night out with friends. The cobblestone streets were deserted, the only sound his footsteps echoing in the cold, crisp air. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, feeling the seclusion and darkness pressing in from all sides. As Lucas turned a corner into a particularly dark and narrow alley, he noticed a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a young woman, her beauty striking and her presence captivating. She seemed out of place, her elegance contrasting sharply with the gloom surrounding them. "Hello," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "Are you lost?" Lucas, taken aback by her sudden appearance, shook his head. "No, just on my way home. What about you? It's not safe to be out here alone." She smiled, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "I could say the same to you. Mind if I walk with you for a bit?" He nodded, unable to resist her charm. As they walked together, Lucas found himself entranced by her presence. They talked, casually, her laughter a soothing melody that put him at ease despite the dark surroundings. However, as they ventured deeper into the darkness, the atmosphere grew colder, more oppressive. Suddenly, without warning, a scream pierced the night. The alley was plunged into an even deeper darkness, swallowing the pair from view. Moments later, a horrific sight emerged from the shadows. Lucas, now a withered, ancient figure, lay on the ground, his life force drained away. His once youthful features were now those of a man over 100 years old. He gasped for breath, his eyes wide with terror and pain. With great effort, Lucas crawled from the darkness, his aged hands clutching the cobblestones. His face, now a mask of death, contorted with agony as he tried to call for help. He managed a few feeble breaths before collapsing completely, the life snuffed out of him. The beautiful woman watched from the shadows, her eyes cold and devoid of the warmth they had shown earlier. She turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind the lifeless, aged husk of Lucas. The town of Hallstatt remained unaware of the terror lurking in its shadows, but the Time Eater was already seeking its next victim. The darkness held its secrets tightly, but Damian Knight and Professor Archer were on their way, determined to uncover the truth and stop the vampire before it could claim more lives. Chapter 3. Damian Knight and Professor Archer stood at the scene of Lucas's death, the cold night air thick with tension. The local police had cordoned off the area, and the body had been taken away, but the lingering sense of dread remained. Damian and Archer spoke with a group of officers, trying to piece together what had happened. An older police officer, with a weathered face and a somber expression, stepped forward to address them. "This isn't the first time this has happened," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. Damian's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. "There have been other cases. People found dead, aged beyond their years. It's as if their time was stolen from them." Professor Archer leaned in, intrigued. "Do you have any idea what could be causing this?" The older officer hesitated before speaking. "There's an old legend about a family from years gone by. It dates back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars. The story goes that a wife, desperate to bring her husband back after he was killed in battle, made a pact to resurrect him. She succeeded, but he came back different. From then on, he had to feed on the lives and time of others to remain alive." Damian listened intently. "And what happened to him?" "Legend says a brave hunter managed to kill him many years ago," the officer replied. "But there are whispers that either he has come back, or one of his descendants carries the same curse." Professor Archer quickly pulled out his laptop, diving into the historical records and old folklore. "We need to find out more about this family," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. As Archer sifted through the digital archives, a strange figure watched from the shadows, its presence barely perceptible. The figure's eyes glinted with an eerie light as it observed the conversation, listening to every word exchanged between the officers and the two men. "Here it is," Archer said, his eyes lighting up as he found a reference. The family name was von Hohenberg. They were a prominent family in this region until they mysteriously vanished. Damian nodded, absorbing the information. "We need to find out if there are any living descendants or any trace of this family left." The older officer added, "There's an old estate on the outskirts of town. It belonged to the von Hohenberg family. No one goes there anymore. It's said to be haunted." Damian's jaw tightened with determination. "Then that's where we'll start." Unbeknownst to them, the figure in the shadows slipped away, disappearing into the night, The Time Eater was aware of their presence, and it would not let its secrets be uncovered so easily. As Damian and Archer prepared to head to the old von Hohenberg estate, they knew they were venturing into a place steeped in dark history and powerful curses. The fight against the Time Eater was just beginning, and they had to be ready for anything. Chapter 4. The early 19th century was a time of great upheaval and conflict in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars raged across the continent, leaving destruction and death in their wake. One of the many battles fought during this period was the Battle of Wagram, a fierce and bloody conflict between Napoleon's forces and the Austrian Empire. On the battlefield, soldiers clashed with swords and muskets, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Among the Austrian soldiers was a brave man from the von Hohenberg estate, a nobleman who fought valiantly for his country. His name was Friedrich von Hohenberg, and he was known for his courage and skill in combat. Friedrich fought with all his might, leading his men with a combination of strategy and sheer will. But amidst the chaos of battle, he was struck down, a fatal wound ending his life. His body was carried back to his estate, where his wife Isolde awaited with a heart full of grief and desperation. Isolde was inconsolable, her sorrow driving her to the brink of madness. Unable to accept her husband's death, she turned to ancient texts and forbidden rituals. She made a pact with supernatural forces, willing to do anything to bring Friedrich back to life. In the dead of night, under a full moon, Isolde performed the ritual. She invoked dark powers, offering her own soul in exchange for her husband's return. The air around her crackled with dark energy as she chanted the incantations, her voice echoing through the silent halls of the von Hohenberg estate. Friedrich's lifeless body began to stir, a faint glow enveloping him. Slowly he rose, his eyes opening to reveal a new, unearthly light. He was alive, but not as he had been before. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow, and a deep hunger gnawed at his soul. He had been brought back, but he was no longer truly human. To survive, he needed to feed on the life essence and time of younger people, draining them of their vitality to sustain his own. For years, Friedrich lived in the shadows, preying on the innocent to maintain his cursed existence. His once noble deeds were forgotten, replaced by the dark legend of the Time Eater. Many attempted to stop him, but it was a brave vampire hunter who finally succeeded. The hunter, armed with knowledge and courage, confronted Friedrich and ended his unnatural life. As Friedrich fell, his wife Isolde slipped into the shadows, her heart shattered by the consequences of her actions. She was never seen again, and the von Hohenberg estate fell into disrepair, a relic of a dark and twisted history. Back in the present, Damian Knight and Professor Archer were unaware of the full extent of the horrors they were about to uncover. As they approached the old von Hohenberg estate, the echoes of the past lingered in the air, a silent warning of the dangers that awaited. The fight against the Time Eater was not just a battle against a single vampire, but a confrontation with the dark legacies of the past. Damian and Archer knew they had to be prepared for whatever they might face, for the shadows of history were long and filled with vengeful spirits. Chapter 4. Damian Knight and Professor Archer moved cautiously through the overgrown grounds of the von Hohenberg estate. The once grand mansion now stood derelict, its windows shattered and walls crumbling. Shadows seemed to dance around them, the air thick with an unsettling chill. As they entered the old mansion, their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the decay that had consumed the estate. The halls were silent, save for the creaking of the old floorboards under their feet. They walked through the dilapidated rooms, finding nothing but the remnants of a bygone era. The mansion was a haunting place, with its peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The scent of mould and dust filled the air, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Each step they took seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past, and the weight of history pressed heavily upon them. When they reached the main hall, something extraordinary happened. The decay and ruin began to fade, replaced by a pristine, grand hall. The walls restored themselves, the chandeliers sparkled, and the room transformed before their eyes. It was as if time itself was rewinding, returning the hall to its former glory. "Archer, what's happening?" Damian asked, his voice tense. "This must be an illusion of some type," Archer replied, his eyes wide with amazement. "No," a voice said, cutting through the air. "This is real." They turned to see a young, beautiful woman entering the grand hall. Her presence was both mesmerizing and chilling. "This is my reality," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "But it comes at a price." Damian and Archer found themselves unable to move, as if an invisible force held them in place. The woman first approached Archer, her eyes appraising him. "You do not have much time for me to take," she said dismissively. Then she moved to Damian, her gaze intense and curious. "You, however, are different. You have delayed time somehow. I can feel your body's time aging, but at a very slow rate. I could feed off you for years. You may even be strong enough to bring back my Friedrich once more." As she spoke, the room began to decay again, returning to its state of ruin. The woman's face contorted in anger and confusion. "No, how is this possible?" Archer, muttering a simple protection incantation under his breath, had managed to break her hold over them. The vampire, taken by surprise, screamed in frustration. The grand illusion shattered, and the hall reverted to its decrepit state. "Your tricks won't work on us," Damian said, regaining his ability to move. "We're here to end this." The woman's eyes blazed with fury. "You think you can stop me? I have lived for centuries, feeding on the time of others. I will not be defeated by mere mortals." As the tension in the room escalated, Damian and Archer prepared for the confrontation. The Time Eater was powerful, but they had faced many dangers before. With determination and skill, they would find a way to stop her and end the curse that plagued the von Hohenberg estate. The battle for the future had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 5. At that moment, Damian and Archer heard a blood-curdling scream from outside. The woman's lips curled into a sinister smile. "It's too late," she whispered before disappearing into the shadows. Damian and Archer sprinted towards the source of the scream, their hearts pounding with urgency. They followed the echoes to the crypt of Friedrich von Hohenberg, where they were met with a horrifying sight. Several old women lay on the floor, their once young and healthy bodies now withered and lifeless. "The Time Eater has been capturing and trapping these young women here," Archer said, his voice trembling with disgust. "All to bring back Friedrich." As they entered the crypt, the air grew thick with a malevolent energy. The tomb at the center of the crypt began to crack, the life essence from the women being drawn into the body inside. Standing by the tomb, Isolde watched with a twisted smile on her face. "It has taken centuries and hundreds of lives to finally bring him back," she said, her voice filled with a mad satisfaction. "He is almost strong enough, but he still needs to feed." With that, she held her arms out in a dramatic gesture and sacrificed herself. Her youthful body aged rapidly, transforming into an ancient, decrepit hag. With her last breath, she whispered, "He will restore me when he has finished with you." She collapsed to the ground, her body turning to dust as the tomb shattered open. Standing before Damian and Archer was Friedrich von Hohenberg, his once noble features now half decayed. His eyes glowed with an insatiable hunger as he surveyed his surroundings. Friedrich's gaze fell on Isolde's lifeless form. Understanding her sacrifice, his expression twisted into one of sorrow and rage. He turned his attention to Damian and Archer, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "I was felled before by your kind, but not this day," he growled, his voice echoing through the crypt. With a roar, Friedrich charged at Damian, grabbing him with a strength that was beyond anything Damian had ever encountered. The force of the impact sent Damian crashing against the wall, the air driven from his lungs. "He's too strong, Archer!" Damian shouted, struggling to free himself from Friedrich's iron grip. Archer, his mind racing, searched for a way to counter the vampire's overwhelming power. The crypt was filled with the echoes of the past and the tangible presence of dark magic. As Friedrich loomed over Damian, ready to drain his life essence, the battle for survival had truly begun. Chapter 6. As Friedrich's grip tightened around Damian's neck, he remembered his training session with his Brazilian jiu-jitsu professor. The old man, with years of wisdom, had managed to defeat him despite Damian's youth, enhanced strength, and aggression. "You rely on strength and power," the professor's voice echoed in his mind. Drawing on those lessons, Damian shifted his body, using leverage and positional advantage to free himself from Friedrich's hold. He rolled away and got to his feet, ready for the next attack. "Wait," Damian said to Archer, who was ready in a spell. "I need to do this." "He's too powerful," Archer screamed. "I know," Damian replied, his eyes locked on Friedrich. "All right, let's do this," he said, bracing himself. Friedrich's supernatural anger fueled his next lunge at Damian. The battle began, with Damian using all his skill and technique rather than brute strength. He dodged, rolled, and countered each of Friedrich's attacks, drawing on every lesson from his training. Despite taking hits and getting trapped several times, Damian managed to escape each time. As the fight wore on, Friedrich's form became more decayed and aged. Archer watched, realizing what Damian was doing. He was fighting time with time. The longer the match continued, the more Friedrich's age caught up with him. The fight seemed to last for hours, but the longer it continued, the more of an edge Damian gained. Each time Friedrich tried to trap and drain Damian's life energy, Damian countered with skill and precision, moving and rolling with the attacks. Friedrich's power started to dwindle significantly. "I must feed," Friedrich screamed, his desperation palpable. He lunged at Archer, but Damian leapt onto his back, sinking in the same chokehold his BJJ professor had used on him. "No!" Friedrich screamed as his body began to vanish, his power failing him. "He's in there." Archer pointed to the tomb as Friedrich's form dissipated. "Let's finish it," Damian said, pushing the tomb lid completely off. Friedrich, now weak and rapidly aging, looked up from the tomb. "No, you must not." "Tell that to these girls," Damian said, dragging Friedrich out of the tomb and continuing the fight. Friedrich, now no match for Damian, weakened with each passing second. "You rely too much on strength and power," Damian said, echoing his professor's words. With a final, desperate gasp, Friedrich's body aged and crumbled to dust, unable to sustain itself any longer. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as Friedrich's curse was finally broken. Archer approached, placing a hand on Damian's shoulder. "You did it." Damian nodded, breathing heavily. "We did it. Let's make sure this place never claims another victim." As they left the crypt, the weight of their victory settled over them. They had faced a formidable foe and emerged victorious, not just with strength, but with skill and wisdom. The von Hohenberg estate was finally free from its dark past, and the night seemed a little less dark as they stepped into the dawn of a new day. Chapter 7. Back in the brightly lit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, Damian Knight was once again on the mat, facing his BJJ professor. The memory of their last encounter and the lessons learned were fresh in his mind. As they circled each other, Damian focused on using technique and positioning rather than relying on his sheer strength. The professor moved swiftly, his hands reaching for Damian's neck to attempt the same choke that had defeated him before. This time, Damian was ready. He countered with precise movements, defending the choke with a series of calculated maneuvers that allowed him to escape and reverse the position. The professor smiled, a look of approval on his face. "Good," he said, nodding. Before Damian could fully relax, the professor transitioned quickly, catching Damian in another type of lock, a tight armbar that threatened to hyperextend his elbow. Damian winced, feeling the pressure but respecting the professor's superior technique. He tapped out, acknowledging the submission. "You're improving, Damian," the professor said as they stood up. "But remember, there's always more to learn. Technique and skill will always be your greatest assets." Damian nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "Thank you, Professor. I appreciate the lesson." The professor clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a strong fighter, Damian. Keep honing your skills, and you'll continue to grow." Later, as Damian left the school, he reflected on his journey. The battle with Friedrich von Hohenberg had taught him the value of patience, skill, and strategy. He knew that his strength alone would not be enough to face the challenges ahead. His mind and technique had to be as sharp as his physical abilities. Meeting up with Professor Archer at their usual cafe, Damian felt a sense of accomplishment and readiness for whatever came next. "How was training?" Archer asked, looking up from his laptop. "Challenging, but good," Damian replied with a grin. "I managed to defend the choke this time." Archer smiled. "That's great to hear. Speaking of challenges, I've been looking into some new leads. It seems there's always another threat lurking in the shadows." Damian's expression grew serious. "Then let's get to work. There's no rest for the Night Slayer." As they began to discuss their next mission, Damian felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight against darkness was far from over, but with each battle, he became stronger and wiser. The night was their battleground, and they would continue to protect the innocent from the horrors that lurked within it. Chapter 8. In the darkness of a fierce storm, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the desolate landscape. The wind howled through the trees, and rain pelted the ground with relentless fury. Amidst the chaos, a shrouded figure moved with silent purpose, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. This figure had been tracking Damian Knight for some time, observing his every move from the shadows. It was not an ordinary vampire, but a true vampire, ancient and parasitic. Its presence exuded an aura of pure evil, and its power was palpable even in the raging storm. The vampire's form was gaunt and twisted, its fangs glistening with a predatory hunger. This was the creature that had taken Damian's wife and child, the same one that had bitten Damian, setting him on his path as the Night Slayer. The memory of that night was etched into Damian's soul, a constant reminder of his loss and the darkness he fought against. As the vampire stood in the storm, it spoke in a voice that was both haunting and familiar. "Soon, my creation, we will have to finish our journey." The words carried through the storm, reaching the very core of Damian's being. The vampire's intent was clear, and the threat it posed was undeniable. This was a creature of unimaginable power and cruelty, and it had unfinished business with Damian. Back at the cafe, Damian felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. He glanced out the window, watching the storm rage outside, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Archer noticed his unease. "Damian, what's wrong?" Damian shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. I don't know. Just a bad feeling, I guess. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The presence of the vampire was something he could sense, a dark connection that he could not ignore. As the storm continued to rage, the vampire's sinister smile grew. It reveled in the fear and chaos it could create, and it was determined to see its plans through to the end. The final confrontation with Damian was approaching, and the vampire was eager to see if its creation could rise to the challenge. The episode ended with the ominous figure of the vampire, standing tall in the storm, a harbinger of the darkness that threatened to engulf Damian once more. The true battle was yet to come, and the fear of what this creature meant to Damian weighed heavily on him. The Night Slayer's journey was far from over, and the greatest test of his strength and resolve was still ahead.